once this is going. As you can see, the subject that I'll be spending some time with you on is called a succession of communities. And as Lita's mentioned, it was sparked very much by my work that started in 2003, working with APKAS and Karavas water project, up through and in general up until, well, quite recently, until the time when COVID probably turned the world upside down. And my sincere thoughts for everyone involved in that. But really, in 2016 or thereabouts, I came to a supervisor in Trobe with an idea that I really wanted to look at the goldfields in Victoria, but at the same time, I wanted to have rather a look at Kythera. This led to some surprise glances. However, I believe that I've convinced people in general, and I hope to convince you. So on the left, Kythera, on the right, the goldfields. Separated, as you can see, by largely a world. However, the correspondences between these two and the insights that Karavas has given me can very much be summarized by this phrase, a succession of communities. So I hope to take you through the work that I've done in the goldfields, but refer regularly to Kythera in the ways in which this idea of the past as a succession of communities has helped me and given me insights to how I approach what at first glance seems to be a very different world. So my project then took place on what is called the Mount Misery diggings, which pretty much says a lot about the conditions that people worked in when they arrived there. The diggings started in the early 1850s and they continued through to the turn of the 19th century at a time when the population of Victoria exploded from what were scattered thousands of people, largely indigenous inhabitants, through, there you are. Resume slideshow. Through to, in the space of 5 years, almost 500,000 people. At the time, the colony of Victoria was developing, and its major industry here was gold. And the yellow that you can see on the map represents the extent and the importance that gold played in this economy. And it was a time when societies were forged, and it was a time when the state of Victoria began to tell everyone else how great it was. So you had this historical narrative starting up. My interest was trying to pierce this, to look at what society inhabited the goldfields, not just in terms of what they looked like, but what dynamics affected their development, what sort of groups of people grew, and how special were they in these very specific circumstances. I was motivated in a way by some tensions that existed in the historical record that needed to be further explained. Things like social coherence versus community difference, and how do we reconcile a society within which largely Chinese miners weren't treated particularly well. At the same time as there was a recognizable society, many people were moving rapidly from one place to another. How do you reconcile these quite different elements of behavior? And thirdly, the goldfields were regarded as being, pretty dangerous places. Well, was this true? Quite often not, and yet it came up repeatedly, even at the time. So how do we make sense of all these three, and how do they all, once we've made sense of them, contribute to identifying a society, and how does it work? So very much society. Now, when I mentioned something about spin, I mentioned about the historical record, I mentioned in part that we have enrolled our past in our present. And in that sense, we've somewhat misrepresented how it was originally, if we even know. But in a sense, the historical record misrepresented itself, even at the time. And this is an example. This is a painting by Eugene von Gerard. It's a miner. He's staring confidently out at the screen at the viewer. He's got a pan full of gold. He's doing pretty well. He's definitely got it, and as he says, I've got it. But what's interesting about that is how neat he is and how orderly everything is. It's all staged. And in that sense, this is not strictly an image telling you all about mining. It's trying to tell people what they should be thinking about mining. This is instant success, prosperity, self-importance. And in that sense, it's not a lot different from the sort of spin that you find from the 1950s on. And this is the sort of thing that if you're looking at the written record, you have to take advantage of, understand. It doesn't invalidate the record, but it means you need to treat it carefully, which places you back in the material record, which puts you back in archaeology, thankfully. But while viewed with suspicion, the historical record tells you many interesting things, and one of which is the intense dynamic life that existed on the goldfields, the diversity of people, of ages, of backgrounds, of activities. You see, a fellow walking his young kids down the street, chatting to a fellow, obviously a miner, a day in the life of someone out there near the minefields. You see women working in manual labor, doing what is necessary and what circumstances demand. You see a family group here working together, in two senses, rocking the cradle, because this is a piece of machinery called a cradle. You see Chinese, a very dominant element in the goldfields, particularly in the Mount Misery area. And although people said that Indigenous people in Victoria were very much marginalised and their land removed from under them, they had a consistent presence throughout this period that wasn't always recognised. So what we have here is an intense level of activity. But what we see now is anything but. And what we see is this haunting absence. It's a landscape surrounded by hints of features. It's a landscape that is very different now from what it was at the height of the goldfields as well. It has been transformed twice. Once during the goldfields to remove all of the green, all of the wood, to dig up and then dig up again. And then afterwards for all of this to grow back and to hide what remained. So of the features that were formed through the activities of mining, the houses, the mines, the machinery, time has pretty much removed all of these elements except for the most basic that remain, the pits in the ground, the hearths that exist alongside what were once the dwellings of miners. And in that sense, what you're happening is something very much like what happened in Kythera. Your cryptic sense of features on the goldfields reminded me so much of walking in the hill above Karavas and seeing what is in this case a Minoan tomb. Yes, interesting, a couple of millennia have passed between that tomb and the current time, but in a sense, the passage of time, whether compressed or long, occupies in many ways the same sequences. And importantly, in the case of visiting and viewing this within a peopled landscape, of which the goldfields were not, this is a succession of communities at work. And when you go to the goldfields and at first glance, you don't see this complex of features. So in the absence of a community, you have alongside it this complex of physical features. The forest has grown up surrounding the goldfields. So much of it is hidden that it's very hard to realize that this is a site where many thousands of people worked. And it's very hard to realize that this is a site where many, many features still remain. And it's only through LiDAR, which allows you to actually pierce the vegetation and see in very fine detail variations on the surface itself. It's only when you see that that you realize that, like Kythera, like the Karavas Basin, the goldfields, and this particular goldfield, the Mount Misery goldfield, is a network of various features in the main, all man-made, all relating to the various aspects of the mining that occurred over 50 or 60 years on this site. You see the sluice channels, you see the large extents of shallow pits and spoil heaps alongside them. You see the hints of a water channel along the contours of the slope. You see the roads, some of which were formed in the course of the mines and others later. You see the path of the creek. All of that, except for, all of that is very difficult to see as a pattern. So without LiDAR, you don't get that sense of the interconnectedness of the features themselves. So armed with all of this, armed with the insights or my understandings of Kythera, armed with my suspicion of the historical record, and also a sense that you're talking about communities and community activity, with my goal being to recreate the lineage of a society, I worked with three sources of data. I worked with the historical record, looking at the diaries and the descriptions that were generated by people both on the diggings and those viewing them, with a healthy level of respect. I took license from the sense that we had mining and mining behavior to look at comparative records around the world. And this is the world of artisanal mining, which is small scale gold mining, largely alluvial, which means working with water, with small groups of people and low level of technology. And there are ongoing small gold rushes around the world, Southeast Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. And unlike the historical record, these have been subjected to a fair amount of anthropological and sociological fieldwork to just understand how they tick. And of course, there never was an opportunity to have anyone appear on the goldfields with a recording device in hand, busy asking people questions about why they're there and what they're doing and all the rest of it. And I'm not quite sure what reception they might have had anyway. The critical part of these three is the material record, because that's where things begin on the goldfields, in a sense, because that's the bulk of what you've got left. But you cannot make sense of that alone. And with these three together, you are much better, or I certainly was much better, able to achieve my aim, which was to recreate a society, to understand its dynamics, how it worked, what made it special. And I came up in a sense with a matrix, and this involved three levels. The first was the spatial, the second was the social, and the third, less definable, but equally important, is the metaphysical. And this, in a sense, follows this natural progression from looking at a static feature to dynamic behavior and then cultural nuance, along the lines of what, in a sense, is processual archaeology. But when it came to Karavas, the spatial for me was the relationship between the mills, the water channels, the gardens, the washing troughs, and the settlements, the features and the spaces surrounding them. The social then became, how did the people operate within this environment? In a sense, certainly, of competition versus cooperation became apparent. People were very much concerned, and still are, about what they own, in part perhaps because land is essential to survival within the limited resources available. And notary cases over the ages have shown that. But at the same time, people cooperate. They cooperate to maintain their water channels. They cooperate when they're working on their gardens, passing by each other in order to work and ensuring that the water goes to each of the gardens in turn. The metaphysical stems from that in a way, because in the sense when places are owned, there are other places that are not. There are places such as springs which are absolutely vital as a resource, but essentially uncontrolled. These areas are the sites of a range of tales and beliefs. And I should at this point make, and I should actually have said earlier, that a lot of what I learned in Kythera, I owe very much to the help and the generosity and the hospitality of Tim and Lita. So when we look at contemporary artisanal mining around the world, we see something different, but we see it in a more structured sense because it's been recorded more carefully. We can see, for instance, when it comes to the spatial, that spaces where wealth is gained are almost always directly adjacent to those spaces where it's spent. This reoccurs regularly because there's a perfectly logical reason for it, but the implications of that have a very large bearing on the level of continued prosperity and the relationship between gaining wealth and ensuring survival. In the social element, membership at a group is absolutely vital. Membership of a group means you learn as a newcomer how to mine, where to mine. You learn where the gold is. You learn the ropes, and these are things that you need to know all the time, a constant flow of information. And in the metaphysical, the sense of securing protection and luck, specific number of articles have talked very much about how people recognize gold almost as an entity in its own right. Gold is discovered, it's not manufactured. Gold is discovered not just because people think they know where it is. There's enough geologists out there telling you, but always almost in a sense of just making sure, getting that extra bit of protection, that maintaining your element of luck involves a certain amount of very specific behavior. And that all ties together at Mount Misery. The spatial Mount Misery are the water races, the terrace alignments, the Chinese camps, and I'll show you these later on. The social element are the sense of the diggings as a combined collective and individual place that isn't just where people lived as opposed to where they were entertained and where they bought their resources. It's also a level of a small group versus a larger group, repeated over the same area. Individual small groups of people mining amongst a larger area filled with hundreds of similar groups. And also the sense of being a member, being a miner, demonstrating continually to others that you are the same as they are, and therefore you are able to access the information that they can give you so that you can survive. It's social capital in a sense. And thirdly, the transformative value of a potential of gold. The historical record talks repeatedly about the goldfields as being a lottery. You can never really know whether you'll get the gold, but that didn't stop tens of thousands of people from trying their luck. Many of them remained there, and they remained there long enough to form a very specific type of society there. Let's look at these two areas from a spatial perspective. And on the left, this is a small part of the Karavas Basin. This is where, perhaps about a kilometre north to south, you can see the black squares are the mills, the races are the blue lines. You can see the green of the fields. So individual features forming repeated patterns as you go down, or rather up the catchment here. And while these are groups, on the other side, you can see these separate settlements, individual clusters of houses, each bearing a name in common with the family name of those who have an association with it. And the springs also. On the right, you see, in a sense, the same collection of types of features. You have the industrial, in the sense, features of the mills. In a sense, you've got the same thing here. The largest thing you see most immediately are these red squares of varying intensity. Each of those squares is a 10 by 10 meter area. The darker the square, the more activity that was carried out in it. You have these sluiced areas here. Sluicing is a process of washing away the soil from a slope, allowing the gold in the soil to be collected. And it's, as you can imagine, quite damaging. So these are large areas associated also. So these are sort of joined by two sets of water races. The first running uphill, the second running closer to what is the Mount Misery Creek, which is the dark blue ribbon along the middle. Now, whilst surrounded by this industrial or activity area, you have specific clusters of settlement. I've numbered them B to D, and each of them are quite distinctly placed, but all of them have a very close relationship to the water channel. And then over here on the right-hand side, you have the old Chinese camp, which is a collection of very specific features. And in that sense, it also, because it's recorded as having a joss house, which is the Chinese temple, a lottery house, gambling area, a saloon where you can go and have a drink, and a variety of shops and stores. So it was, if you like, the commercial heart of the Mount Misery diggings. So if you look at these a bit more closely, I've taken a section from the Mount Misery diggings, and I've taken an area which is known as Karamari or Kambi in the Karavas Basin. These features are distinguished by two things. One is by task, if you like. Feature is distinguished by the style of the activity that took place. So a sluiced area is very much an industrial activity. The collective activities revolve in civic life around things like the oven or the tank, and I'll show you examples of them. Here, there are drainage channels that were part of market gardens that grew up later. And you've got these tracks at the time running through the middle. So, and then you've got these water races that fill in the gap between. So while, and on the other side here, you've got a similar thing happening. You've got the mills and the channels. You've got the terraces, and you've got the houses of pens. They occupy, they relate to different purposes, but what's interesting in both is they're also overlaid by era. So when we talk about a succession of communities, we're reinforcing the sense that every time a new community appears, it's carrying on a variety of the same relationship between itself and the resource surrounding it. And while you can say in Kambi that there is several millennia separating the Karavas mill and the modern road for that matter, with say a Minoan tomb and Minoan sherds found elsewhere and all of the things in between. In the Mount Misery, it's really only 150 years. But interestingly, it's still, if you like, an overlay, a succession. The modern road here is superimposed along with the car park and a modern picnic ground on what was the market gardens that existed here and were in use until the first decade of the 20th century. And these two in themselves are superimposed on a more complex landscape, which was the life of the Chinese camp at the height of its existence, when it was the site of 400 or 500 people living and working in the area. So the same sense of communities, the one several millennia, the other 150 years, compressed but still overlaid successively. So within these areas, you have specific features, and I'll run you quickly through features on the Mount Misery digging and equivalent features at in Kythera, in the Karavas Basin specifically. And bear in mind, when I show the ones in the Karavas Basin, there is a sense of the human, a sense of the social that is absent in the other two. You can see this almost immediately in the first one here. On the left here are two houses, the remnants of what were two structures. All that's left are two terraces and the hearths. This almost square with a central hearth and a separate entrance. Designed to last, it had a drainage ditch to stop it flooding. The building would most likely have been bark and canvas, possibly with an iron roof. Time has removed all of that. Some devastating bushfires have come through repeatedly and removed much of the flammable material, and people have basically fossicked the rest, taken it away. So the passage of time has been very accelerated in this area. On the right, we have a room in the abandoned cluster of Mavro-Georgianica sitting up above Amirali. And similarly, you can see that sense of a domestic involved here. More evident here because more has survived, but bear in mind, this is mortar and stone. It will last longer. These, by nature, will disappear very, very quickly, leaving, unfortunately, very little in their wake. We have industrial features present in both areas. On the left, on the goldfields, we have here the base of what would have been a steam boiler. It would be a large pressure boiler that would be filled with water. It would generate steam, which would power mining machinery nearby. This was steam powered later in the life of the diggings, in maybe the 1870s and onward. But an earlier feature, and an interesting one, is here called a puddling machine, where, as you can see, a circular trough was dug, a horse pulled a fork through the middle of that trench, and heavy clay slurry would be put in there. The fork would loosen it and separate it, and then the slurry could then be searched for gold more easily. So industrially, if you like, horsepower from the earliest times, from the 1850s, was used through to steam later on. In a different sense, but equally occupying that level of production, on Kythera you have here the Kouvolis mill, which is seems to conform to a standard 3-area sense with a domestic ring here, a machinery, and, if you like, a reception or storage area in between. And then below that we have an interesting, what I've called a workshop. No one is really certain exactly what purpose it served. There's a hint that there was a wine press associated with it, but it's so complex, it sits where it is, that it served the purpose, I believe, of a collective industrial element. And then beyond that, you have the collective itself. This is, if you like, the civic. The civic being somewhere where people collate, where they work interactively. On the left is something that has only recently been discovered, and it's very likely to have been what's called a pig oven. Pig ovens feature reasonably large in Chinese ritual on the goldfields north in Queensland, where the oven is a deep pit dug on a slope. It's lined with heat-retaining material. The pig is hung above the fire and more or less steamed for a long period of time. It would feed a dozen people or more. So it's the site of a large feast. And it's generally associated with a temple or a joss house nearby, which we haven't found. And below this, we have a very carefully made rectangular feature, carefully lined with 2 layers of clay. It sits in the middle of the settlement on a level area. Its siting makes you consider that it also has a collective function. So in terms of the collective on Kythera, you can look, for instance, at Portokalia, which is the spring. And it's interesting. It has 3 elements to it. It has the spring itself. And below that, you have an area for, if you like, celebration, recreation. But equally interesting above, you've got up here, which is the Tsipuru factory. It likes to call it a factory, sounds great, but effectively they make Tsipuru there. And this is something that I found quite interesting, all combined in the same area, very much a collective area. Another example of the Manganu systems, which are of great complexity, comprising a number of wells and also an area to divert the water during times of heavy runoff. diverting water to a variety of different areas. Now, this would take more than 1 or 2 people to continue to maintain. So in that sense, also a collective feature. So in both areas, features divide up between collective, domestic, and industrial. And of course, there are overlaps. And sometimes it's the overlaps that are most interesting. And like the features, the spaces surround them also break up. But the big difference between looking at Kythera and looking at the goldfields is that in the features in Kythera, you've got a sense of people, a sense of life. You've got a sense that people actually created them and lived alongside them. So whilst we've got on the bottom here this empty, the most well-preserved hearth on the Mount Misery diggings, above there we've got a fireplace in Mavro Georgianico with carefully decorated, but at some point people have changed aesthetics, who knows, decided, well, we'll just mortar that up. It looks better that way. Something's going on there. Something tells you a lot more about why that's there and why it looks the way it does. That's the element missing on the Mount Misery diggings. Similarly, this is an abandoned water race. It's the equivalent, if you like, of this water channel also in the Karavas Basin, but this has a washing trough immediately in it. It has a well-maintained wall above it. Water still runs through it. So it's the heart of a social life. So we know and we can see the social life through these features on Kythera. We know they existed on the Mount Misery diggings, and this is the part that we're trying to find out more about. And that's the key in many ways through the feature, to find out more about how people lived and how the way in which they lived helped form how they became as a society. So like features, the spaces surrounding them also have specific relationships. So here we see the relationship between industrial features, these areas of activity in red and these sluiced areas, with the channels that serve to connect them. They serve also to connect the individual scatters of settlement from E and B and C. So these features tend to exhibit similar patterns of coexistence. This heavily civic area, this center of entertainment, center of recreation, center of ritual, if you like, but also the shops, exists directly alongside here, a heavy industrial area comprising multiple pits on the terraces and the sluiced area. So this interesting juxtaposition of industrial, where wealth is made, through to commercial, where wealth is spent, in ways in which we don't do that in the society we live in. We tend to make quite distinct differences between this, but not so there. In a similar way in Kythera, you see this interesting repeating of patterns of mill, garden, race, spring coming up all the time, existing alongside each other, employing a collective sense that is markedly missing when you look at the settlements, which are distinguished quite carefully in interesting ways, each of them distinguished as much by name and therefore, in a sense, family, as by the physical distinction between them. So this is what I mean about moving from feature into space. Once you start talking about space, interesting things start happening. And once you start talking about space, you then start beginning to talk about socially interpreted space. And here we've got the spring. It's interesting to me that you see socially interpreted space very clearly on Kythera. This is a spring. In a sense, it's most important because water, the center of all your life, is coming from somewhere, and it's celebrated. The area is carefully cleaned. It's an area for recreation and celebration. It's whitewashed. And interestingly, there's a succession of plaques. People have put their names above the spring. And I don't believe it's anything to do necessarily with saying, look at me, look at me. In a sense, it's almost like saying, I've done the right thing. I've done this. I've done what's expected of me, and I hope it does some good. Let me go back. And in that sense, it's an interesting way in which you are commemorating not so much yourself, but the place where all things come from. Interestingly, it's unowned. You can't own water. You necessarily can't own the spring in many important ways. And it becomes also a place where odd things happen. You don't want to be there, for instance, in the middle of the day, or strange visions occur. But these people don't necessarily believe implicitly. They make a good story. But the important thing is that these stories are told repeatedly. So they have some significance. So having seen that happening in Kythera, I thought, well, what do we get? What do we have on the goldfields? And this is one example of what we do have. The same artist, by the way. This is Ballarat as it thinks it should have been. Very organized, very linear. People just mooching around, looking at all the nice things around them. Everything is neat, ordered, structured. Everything has its place, and that is a carefully organized and enclosed place. Just over the hill, of course, is anything but. There's all sorts of things going on here. It's a nightmare. People are so fixed on the work that they don't really have any interest in making sure it all neatly lines up. So what happens in a sense is that you get this cultural thing happening where people suddenly begin to be threatened by anything that is not organized, anything that is disorganized, anything that doesn't have boundaries. And you can see that happening in the way in which people talked about the goldfields. And this is where what can be trusted from the historical record becomes important. And it's also validated in accounts of artisanal mining in current goldfields elsewhere. So space, once formed, can be socially interpreted. And that social interpretation can tell you a lot about the society. And then we get into the metaphysical, which is perhaps the hardest part, but in some ways the most interesting. The metaphysical can be the spring, but it's equally, in a sense, transferred over to the shrine. So it's a part of everyone's world to such a degree that it's not commented on. It's just there. The degree to which you believe in the power of a certain place or a certain thing is never commented on. It's just there. So it's embedded in a society. So when I was looking for this sort of metaphysical element, the element of securing protection, retaining luck, if you like, I was looking for that in the goldfields, and I found, if anything, it helped look at distinctions between cultures and helped explain perhaps why two cultures can live alongside each other, but also what made them so different. The Chinese on the goldfields had, in a sense, already a very strong relationship with luck. Lady Luck is part of the cosmology, if you like, of certainly of Chinese miners and Chinese temples. So every mining village, every mining settlement had its joss house. Some existed until quite recently. So that sort of fitted in very easily, in a sense, with a Chinese frame of reference. The goldfields for miners, European miners, on the other hand, was quite different. They came from many different areas. And it didn't have a unified sense. Unlike the Chinese, who had already a very strong identity, miners had to continually reforge their own by behaving in ways that ensured that they met together, talked together, communicated, shared the information that was vital to their own existence. And the gold they found then wasn't simply something that made them wealthy. The gold, in a sense, was a transfiguration. It could make them rich in the sense that winning a lottery could, but it also represented this kind of success of luck. You've found something, you've validated yourself as much as anything. And what they've done here is an example of what's called goldfields bling. So he's found his nugget, but rather than heading off and spending it, he said, he went to a goldsmith saying, take this gold and make something beautiful out of it. Which is what they did. So you've got this whole different attitude. In a way, you could almost look at it as, as giving thanks. This is my success, an emblem of my success, and it stayed that way. So after all of that, and I gather I'm encroaching on your time here, so I'll be quick from here on in. What are the insights that Kythera gave me? Certainly in reference to those points that I started this talk with. So in terms of social coherence and community differences, how is it that Chinese miners were treated appallingly, but yet remained a part of a consistent community on the diggings? And I think in many ways we can look at the importance of identity and community as, in a sense, evident on Kythera, harnessed by competing forces that both pull it together and draw it apart. Once you understand that these forces can exist in a community, you are better able to understand how they can occur in others. So, okay, social coherence, how do we distinguish a society and while it's moving all over the place? By looking at the association between social and physical place, we had a better sense that physical space is social space. It's interpreted, it's appropriated. In a sense, you take your space with you. So if you move somewhere else, space reoccurs, it redevelops. A mind moves into a different area. The same arrangements in space occur, in part through practicality, but also because this is how people are themselves organized. And finally, disorder and danger. Well, what I did find out in the way is that everyone always says it's dangerous somewhere else. And this is what they did on the diggings. On the mines, on the diggings, they said, oh, it's awful outside, just on the fringes, but it's great here. They said there's bush ranges in the hill, but you find here people outside the goldfields themselves had none of that. They just said the diggings are a terrible place always. So it depends very much on where you are as what it is, what you say. This sense of socially interpreted space is really then a spur to looking more closely at the historical record and linking it in a sense with the way in which features and spaces, material, physically are organized and interpreting it in terms of the society that used it. So these are the three things that Kythera gave me, for which I am extremely thankful. And that's it. Be very happy to answer any questions that people may have.